Michael Cohen was back on the stand Thursday in court. Donald Trump's attorneys were much more aggressive in questioning him than they had been earlier in the trial. They sought to undercut some of his testimony from earlier in the week. Their performance, which was much more aggressive, is not only important for the jury, but it's something that's important to their client. Donald Trump is known as someone who likes his attorneys to be tough and bulldoggish, and that's the kind of performance they showed in court on Thursday. Court is scheduled off on Friday. Donald Trump is expected to attend his son's graduation. They're expected to be back in court on Monday, and Michael Cohen is expected to be back on the stand.
Okay, so this is absolutely insane. A secret recording from inside Donald Trump's legal war room has just been leaked, and when prosecutors played it in court, the jury literally gasped. We're talking about confidential conversations between Trump and his lawyers, the kind of stuff that's supposed to be protected by attorney-client privilege, now out in the open and being used against him in federal court. This is the kind of bombshell that could completely destroy Trump's entire defense strategy, and honestly, it's one of the wildest legal developments we've seen in this whole saga. So what exactly happened here? Well, according to multiple reports from early October and November, recordings and transcripts from closed-door meetings between Trump and his legal team have surfaced and made their way into the hands of prosecutors. We're not talking about speculation or hearsay. We're talking about actual audio recordings of Trump discussing his legal strategy for fighting classified document charges. And apparently what's on those tapes is so damaging that when a private investigator played them in court, you could hear the jury audibly react. That's how bad this is. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest. You can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video. The timeline here is crucial. Around October 8th and 9th, secret transcripts and recordings from a Trump legal meeting were leaked to major media outlets and prosecutors. These recordings detail strategies to handle obstruction charges in the classified documents investigation, basically the entire playbook that Trump's team was using to defend him. Now here's where it gets really sketchy. Prosecutors obtained this recording either with help from a cooperating lawyer, meaning someone on Trump's own legal team flipped, or through a search warrant. Either way, Trump's got a massive problem because the people who are supposed to be protecting him might be the ones handing prosecutors the evidence they need to convict him. Think about that for a second. Your own lawyer, someone who's supposed to be bound by confidentiality, potentially cooperating with prosecutors and giving them recordings of your private strategy sessions. That's a nightmare scenario for any defendant, let alone someone facing federal charges related to classified documents and obstruction of justice. The recording reportedly reveals Trump's attorneys discussing arguments, possible misleading statements, and whether confidential documents were withheld from investigators. This isn't just embarrassing, this is potentially criminal. If those recordings show Trump and his lawyers actively planning to mislead investigators or hide evidence, that's obstruction. That's a whole new level of legal exposure. And according to reports from November 13th, a private investigator possesses damning audio of Trump discussing things his lawyers have been denying for months. When this audio was played in court, it made the jury gasp. Let that sink in. Jurors who are supposed to remain impartial and stoic throughout proceedings were so shocked by what they heard that they audibly reacted. That tells you this recording contains something truly explosive, something that contradicts whatever story Trump's team has been trying to sell. Now you might be thinking, wait, isn't this protected by attorney-client privilege? How can prosecutors even use recordings of private conversations between a lawyer and their client? Great question. And the answer is something called the crime-fraud exception. Basically, attorney-client privilege doesn't apply if those conversations were used to plan or commit a crime. Judges have ruled that if Trump and his lawyers were discussing how to obstruct justice or hide evidence, then those conversations aren't protected. The privilege gets pierced and everything becomes fair game for prosecutors. This is a major legal turning point because it means prosecutors can now access Trump's full defense strategy. They know what arguments he's planning to make. They know what evidence he's trying to hide. They know everything. It's like playing poker when your opponent can see all your cards. You're not going to win that game. The leak also raises some serious questions about who's cooperating and why. If a lawyer on Trump's team is the one who provided these recordings, that's a massive betrayal. But it also suggests that person believes Trump committed crimes and they don't want to go down with him. Lawyers have ethical obligations, and if they participated in criminal activity, even at a client's direction, they can face serious consequences themselves. So it makes sense that someone might flip to save their own skin. But if prosecutors got these recordings through a search warrant, that raises different questions. What evidence did they present to a judge to get that warrant? What were they looking for? And what else might they have found during that search? Either way, the fact that these recordings exist and are now being used in court is catastrophic for Trump's defense. We're also seeing reports that this leak gives prosecutors access to Trump's full defense strategy, sparking debate about the ethics of attorney cooperation and increasing the risk of more indictments or obstruction charges. This isn't just about the classified documents case anymore. If prosecutors can prove Trump tried to obstruct their investigation, that's a separate crime with separate penalties. We could be looking at additional charges, more trials, and an even longer legal nightmare for Trump. And all of this is playing out in real time in front of juries and judges who are watching Trump's credibility crumble. When your own lawyer's recordings contradict your public statements, you've got a serious problem. When juries gasp at what they hear on those recordings, you know you're in trouble. This is the kind of development that changes everything, and we need to break down exactly what it means for Trump's legal future and his political prospects. Alright, so let's dig deeper into what's actually on these recordings and why they're so devastating, because the surface level story is crazy enough, but when you understand the legal implications, this gets so much worse for Trump. First, we need to understand what attorney-client privilege is and why it's such a big deal that it's being pierced here. Attorney-client privilege is one of the oldest and most sacred protections in law. The idea is simple. You need to be able to talk to your lawyer completely honestly without fear that anything you say will be used against you. If people couldn't trust their lawyers to keep secrets, the entire legal system would fall apart. Nobody would get proper representation because they'd be afraid to tell their lawyers the truth. So courts take this privilege very seriously. They don't just throw it out on a whim. The fact that judges are allowing prosecutors to use these recordings means they believe there's strong evidence that Trump and his lawyers crossed the line from legal defense into criminal conspiracy. The crime fraud exception exists for exactly this reason. If a client is using their lawyer to help commit a crime or cover one up, that's not legitimate legal advice anymore. That's participation in criminal activity. And lawyers can't hide behind privilege when they're helping someone break the law. So what did these recordings contain that convinced judges to pierce the privilege? Well, according to reports, the recordings show Trump's attorneys discussing whether confidential documents were withheld from investigators and talking about possible misleading statements. That's obstruction language right there. If Trump and his lawyers were strategizing about how to hide documents or lie to investigators, that's not legal defense, that's criminal obstruction of justice. The classified documents case has been a mess from the beginning. Trump took boxes of sensitive materials when he left the White House. The National Archives asked for them back. Trump claimed he didn't have them or that they were his personal property. Then the FBI executed a search warrant at Mar-a-Lago and found classified documents all over the place in his office, in storage rooms, even in a bathroom. Trump's been claiming this was all a misunderstanding, that he had the authority to declassify anything he wanted, and that he was cooperating with investigators. But these leaked recordings apparently tell a very different story. If the tapes show Trump and his lawyers discussing how to hide documents or mislead investigators about what he had, that completely destroys his defense. It shows consciousness of guilt, the legal term for when someone knows they did something wrong and takes steps to cover it up. That's extremely damaging in court. Juries hear evidence like that, and it's game over. You can't claim you didn't know you were breaking the law when there's a recording of you and your lawyers plotting how to hide the evidence. Now let's talk about the private investigator angle, because that adds another layer of intrigue to this whole thing. Who hired this private investigator? What were they looking for? And how did they get access to these recordings? Private investigators don't just stumble onto attorney-client conversations. Someone had to give them access or point them in the right direction. This suggests there's a whole shadow investigation happening parallel to the official prosecution. Could be opposition research. Could be someone with a grudge against Trump. Could even be someone from inside his own organization who's trying to expose what really happened. We don't know yet, but the fact that a private investigator has this audio and was able to present it in court is wild. The November 13th report about the jury gasping when they heard the recording is particularly significant. Juries are instructed to remain neutral and not show emotion during trials. They're supposed to evaluate evidence objectively without reacting visibly. The fact that this recording provoked such a strong reaction that people could hear them gasp suggests the content was truly shocking. What could be on that tape that would shock a jury? Well, think about it. These jurors have already heard a lot of evidence about Trump taking classified documents and refusing to return them. They've probably heard testimony about obstruction and attempts to hide evidence. For something to shock them at this point, it would have to be pretty damning. Maybe Trump admitting he knew he shouldn't have the documents. Maybe Trump directing his lawyers to lie to investigators. Maybe Trump discussing destroying evidence. Any of those things would be jaw-dropping moments in a courtroom. And if prosecutors have that on tape, Trump's defense is basically dead in the water. Let's also talk about what this means for Trump's legal team, because they're in a really bad position now. If one of their colleagues cooperated with prosecutors and provided these recordings, that creates massive trust issues. How do you continue working on a defense when you don't know who might be recording conversations or talking to prosecutors? The whole team is going to be paranoid and second guessing everything. And if any of the lawyers on those recordings were discussing ways to obstruct justice, they could face their own criminal charges. The bar associations in various states could open disciplinary proceedings. They could lose their licenses to practice law. Their careers could be over. So there's enormous pressure on anyone who participated in these conversations to either flip and cooperate or lawyer up themselves. This is how conspiracy cases work. Prosecutors squeeze the people around the main target until someone breaks and starts talking. It looks like that's exactly what's happening here. The ethical questions surrounding this are fascinating and troubling. Did the cooperating lawyer violate their duty to Trump by recording conversations and turning them over to prosecutors? Well, not if those conversations were in furtherance of a crime. Lawyers have an ethical obligation not to help clients commit crimes. If a client asks a lawyer to help them destroy evidence or lie to investigators, the lawyer is supposed to refuse and potentially withdraw from the case. They're not supposed to participate in the criminal activity. So if a lawyer recorded these conversations because they believe crimes were being planned, they might actually have been fulfilling their ethical obligations rather than violating them. But that's going to be debated by legal ethics experts for years to come. The timing of these leaks is also interesting. October and November 2025 puts us right in the middle of Trump's second term and heading toward the 2026 midterms. These revelations are going to dominate the news cycle and energize Democratic voters who want to see Trump held accountable. Republicans are going to have to defend Trump against these allegations, which is getting harder and harder as more evidence comes out. And moderate voters who might have given Trump the benefit of the doubt are going to hear about recordings of him discussing obstruction with his lawyers and think, yeah, he's guilty. This is the kind of thing that shapes public opinion and influences elections. Democrats are absolutely going to use this in campaign ads. You can already see how they'd frame it. Trump broke the law, tried to cover it up, and now his own lawyers are testifying against him. That's a devastating message. The legal implications extend beyond just this one case, too. If prosecutors can prove Trump obstructed justice in the classified documents investigation, that opens the door to charges related to other investigations. Did he obstruct justice in the January 6th investigation? Did he try to interfere with election certification in Georgia? Are there other cases where he directed people to lie or hide evidence? Once you establish a pattern of obstruction, it becomes much easier to prosecute other cases because you can show this is how Trump operates. He doesn't respect legal processes, he tries to hide evidence, and he encourages others to lie for him. That's a powerful narrative for prosecutors to build. One thing that's not getting enough attention is how this affects Trump's ability to defend himself in other cases. His legal strategy in the classified documents case is now completely exposed. Prosecutors know every argument he was planning to make, every piece of evidence he was trying to suppress, every witness he was worried about. That's an enormous advantage. But it also means Trump's lawyers are going to have to completely rethink their approach in all his other cases. They can't use the same strategies because prosecutors will expect them. They can't rely on the same arguments because those arguments are already compromised. This forces Trump to essentially start from scratch in building his defense, and he's running out of time and money to do that. The financial costs of these legal battles are staggering. Trump's spending millions on lawyers, and every time something like this happens, he has to bring in new lawyers who need to get up to speed on the case. That takes time and costs even more money. And now with recordings being leaked and lawyers potentially flipping, Trump's going to have a harder time finding competent attorneys willing to represent him. Who wants to be the lawyer who goes down with Trump when his other lawyers are cooperating with prosecutors? It's a toxic situation, and it's only getting worse. Okay, let's break this down into what actually matters going forward, because there's a lot of legal complexity here, but only a few things really determine Trump's fate. Point 1. The crime fraud exception to attorney-client privilege is in play, and that's absolutely devastating for Trump. Once prosecutors can access privileged communications, they basically have a roadmap to his entire defense. They know what he's thinking, what he's worried about, and what he's trying to hide. That's an insurmountable advantage in any legal proceeding. You can't win a case when the other side knows your entire strategy before you even present it. Point 2. The jury's reaction to the leaked recording tells us everything we need to know about how damaging it is. Jurors who gasp when hearing evidence aren't gasping because they're bored or confused. They're gasping because they just heard something that fundamentally changes their understanding of the case. That kind of reaction usually means someone just got caught in a major lie, or there was a dramatic admission of wrongdoing. Either way, it's terrible news for Trump's defense. Point 3. If lawyers on Trump's team are cooperating with prosecutors, that creates a cascade effect where other lawyers and witnesses start to worry about their own exposure. Nobody wants to be the last person standing when the ship goes down. People start making deals, providing evidence, and trying to save themselves. That's how these cases typically end. Not with a dramatic trial, but with the domino effect of cooperating witnesses that leaves the main defendant isolated and defenseless. Now let's talk about what this means for the classified documents case, specifically. Trump's been arguing that he had the authority to declassify any documents he wanted as president, and therefore he couldn't have broken the law by taking them. But if these recordings show him acknowledging that certain documents were classified and discussing how to hide them from investigators, that argument completely falls apart. You can't claim you thought you were allowed to have the documents when there's a tape of you discussing how to keep them hidden from the people asking for them back. That's consciousness of guilt, and it's one of the most damaging types of evidence in any criminal case. The obstruction charges that might come from these recordings are actually more serious than the original classified documents charges. Mishandling classified information is bad, but it's sometimes treated as a relatively minor offense, especially for high-level officials. Obstruction of justice, on the other hand, is a direct attack on the legal system itself. It shows someone knew they did something wrong and actively tried to prevent investigators from finding out. That's the kind of thing that gets you serious prison time. And if prosecutors can prove Trump obstructed justice, it becomes much easier to convict him on the underlying classified documents charges because the obstruction itself proves he knew he was breaking the law. Let's also talk about the political fallout, because this is happening at the worst possible time for Trump and Republicans. The 2026 midterms are coming up, and Republicans need to maintain control of Congress to protect Trump from impeachment and to advance their legislative agenda. But how do you campaign on law and order when your party's leader is being exposed for allegedly obstructing justice? How do you attack Democrats for being soft on crime when recordings of your own president discussing how to hide evidence are playing in courtrooms? It's a messaging nightmare. Democrats are going to hammer this relentlessly. Every campaign ad, every debate, every stump speech is going to mention these recordings and the jury's reaction. They're going to paint Republicans as the party that protects criminals and undermines the rule of law. And honestly, that's a pretty effective message when you've got actual recordings of Trump discussing obstruction with his lawyers. Republicans are going to try to spin this as a political witch hunt, but that's getting harder to maintain when Trump's own lawyers are providing evidence against him. You can claim the system is rigged all you want, but when people who are on your side start cooperating with prosecutors, that suggests there's real criminal activity happening, not just political persecution. The question of who leaked these recordings is also crucial because it points to deeper problems within Trump's inner circle. If this was a lawyer who decided to cooperate, that means someone close to Trump concluded that protecting him wasn't worth risking their own freedom and career. That's a devastating indictment of Trump's leadership and loyalty. People are supposed to be willing to go down fighting for their leader, but instead they're jumping ship and providing evidence against him. That sends a message to everyone else in Trump's orbit. You're on your own if things go bad. If the recordings came from a search warrant rather than a cooperating lawyer, that raises questions about what other evidence prosecutors might have obtained. Search warrants don't just target one thing. They often uncover additional evidence of crimes that weren't even being investigated initially. So if prosecutors executed a search warrant on Trump's lawyers' offices or communications, they might have found material related to other cases too. We could be looking at new indictments or charges that nobody's even talking about yet. The private investigator angle is also worth exploring because it suggests there are non-governmental actors conducting serious investigations into Trump's activities. Private investigators don't come cheap, and whoever hired this one clearly had significant resources and motivation to uncover wrongdoing. This could be a political rival, a wealthy donor with an axe to grind, or even a former Trump associate who feels betrayed. Whoever it is, they've managed to obtain evidence that's now being used in federal court, which means they're playing a significant role in holding Trump accountable. Now let's talk about what happens next, because this story is far from over. Trump's lawyers are going to file motions to suppress the recordings, arguing that they should never have been admitted as evidence. They'll claim attorney-client privilege was violated, that the crime-fraud exception doesn't apply, and that allowing these recordings sets a dangerous precedent that will harm all attorney-client relationships. Some of those arguments might have merit, but given that judges have already allowed the recordings to be played in court, it seems unlikely they're going to reverse course now. The prosecution is going to use these recordings as the centerpiece of their case. They'll play them for the jury, walk through what Trump and his lawyers were discussing, and explain why those conversations show criminal intent and obstruction. They'll bring in expert witnesses to testify about what the conversations mean in legal terms. And they'll probably have cooperating lawyers testify about what was happening during those meetings and why they decided to provide the recordings to prosecutors. That testimony is going to be absolutely brutal for Trump because it's coming from people who were supposed to be on his side. We're also likely to see more leaks and revelations as other people in Trump's orbit decide to cooperate or speak out. Once the dam breaks and one person starts talking, others often follow. They don't want to be the ones left holding the bag while everyone else cuts deals. So expect more recordings, more documents, and more testimony in the coming weeks and months. The impact on Trump's other legal cases can't be overstated. He's facing multiple criminal and civil trials, and this development is going to affect all of them. Prosecutors in other cases are going to point to these recordings as evidence of Trump's general pattern of obstructing justice and lying to investigators. Judges are going to be less inclined to believe Trump's denials or give him the benefit of the doubt. And juries are going to hear about these recordings even if they're not directly admissible in other cases because the media coverage is going to be everywhere. You can't unring that bell. The long-term consequences for attorney-client privilege are also worth considering. If courts start routinely allowing prosecutors to access privileged communications based on allegations of crime fraud, that could have a chilling effect on how lawyers and clients communicate. People might be less honest with their lawyers if they think those conversations could be recorded and used against them. That would be bad for the legal system as a whole. But at the same time, lawyers can't be allowed to help clients commit crimes while hiding behind privilege. It's a difficult balance, and this case is going to shape how courts handle that balance for years to come. For Trump personally, this is potentially the beginning of the end of his legal defense strategy. Once your own lawyers are providing evidence against you, it's very hard to mount an effective defense. You can't trust your legal team, you can't predict what evidence prosecutors have, and you can't control the narrative anymore. That's a losing position in any legal battle. The bottom line is this. Secret recordings of Trump discussing obstruction with his lawyers have been leaked and are being used in court. The jury gasped when they heard them, which tells you how damaging they are. Prosecutors now have access to Trump's entire defense strategy and potentially have cooperating witnesses from within his legal team. This is a catastrophic development for Trump's classified documents case and potentially for all his other legal battles. The political consequences are enormous, with the 2026 midterms hanging in the balance and Republicans forced to defend a president who's being exposed for allegedly obstructing justice. We're watching Trump's legal defenses crumble in real time, and the recordings are the smoking gun that prosecutors needed to prove he knew exactly what he was doing and tried to cover it up. Stay tuned, because this story is about to get even crazier and the fallout is going to be massive.